Welcome to Down the Garden Path. I'm your host, Joanne Shaw, landscape designer and plant lover. I enjoy discussing down-to-earth tips and advice to help you seasonally manage your garden and landscape. And I also aim to bring you interesting and relevant topics to educate you all about the landscaping and horticultural industry. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Down the Garden Path. Today, I have with me Stephen Biggs, a horticulturalist and food garden geek with his website, foodgardenlife.com, and we are going to talk about olives and Stephen's new book, Grow Olives Where You Think You Can't, How to Grow an Olive Tree in a Pot. I'm so fascinated. I loved the fig tree, and Stephen was successful in getting me to start growing 2 fig trees. So now I'm excited to talk about olives. Welcome to the show, Stephen.
Thanks, Joanne. Great to be here to talk about olives.
Excellent. So where did you go from figs to olives? Like, how did that come about?
Well, I went from figs to lemons, and then I
Okay.
went to olives. And
Okay. I thought
these
lemons
are all,
came first. It's funny. I thought lemons came first, but okay.
yeah. And so these are all things I grow in my garden here in Toronto. And they're things that people don't expect to see in a cold climate garden. And I've got so much interest from people about them. That's how I've ended up. I do talks on them and I've written these books. I teach courses on them too. So um, the the olive is a fun one because this is a tree or it can be a bush that grows really well in a pot. So even if you're somewhere cold like me, you can still grow it in a pot and it'll do really, really well. And they live for hundreds of years.
Wow.
And so you can think of this as a family heirloom. I've often talked to people with fig trees who pass these figs down from generation to generation. And you can do the same with your olive tree because they're tough as nails. They grow well in a pot. And most important, and especially because you're in design, you'll appreciate this. They're beautiful. They've got
Yeah.
these leaves that shimmer when they move in the breeze. These leaves, they're a greeny silver color,
Mhm.
and they add this whole element of light to a garden, which is really phenomenal. So you could have a potted olive tree, say on your deck or patio, maybe use it for some screening, but you
Mhm.
could have a pair of them to frame an entranceway. So I have 2 of them on either side of the stairs up to my deck. It's like a frame. Or
Oh,
if you wanted a focal point in your garden, then you could have a potted olive tree and it would look amazing. So there's lots of opportunity for them in the northern garden.
excellent. And where are they readily available? Where do you find them?
Well, the neat thing is I'm seeing them more and more
Oh,
in stores,
okay.
and people tend to the garden centers often bring them in at this time of year in the spring.
Mhm.
And so I was just out last week and I saw 2 different garden centers with olive trees. So they're out there. And there are some things to think about if you're thinking about an olive tree, but you also have in mind that you want to pick olives, because this is possible. By the way, I've picked olives here in Toronto, and it always surprises people when I show
Mhm.
them my Toronto grown olives. But you do need to keep in mind a couple of things. So I could talk about that now, or we can get to it later, depending what you want to cover.
Yeah, no, let's talk about growing olives and how to grow the tree. I was just curious because I've seen fig trees around and I bought them from garden centers. I haven't
Hmm.
looked for olive trees, but I haven't seen them. So it's good to know that for our listeners that they are available at garden centers, or I guess you can ask for them too, right?
Yeah, and actually, here's one more resource. So there are some specialty nurseries. If you're looking for specific olive varieties, there are some specialty nurseries that do mail order. And I have a listing on my website, foodgardenlife.com, of nurseries with exotic plants. And so if after this podcast you're thinking, I want to go and get an olive tree, I want that list, you'll find it on the site, or just email me through the site. I'll point you right towards that article.
Excellent. Okay. Now, how do we grow olives?
Okay. So I guess let's back up. First, you're going to buy an olive that is suited to a home garden. So the thing is, not all olive varieties will self-pollinate. It's like apples, where you need two different varieties to have pollination take place. And in a home garden, this might not be practical because maybe we only have space for one tree. So the thing is to get an olive variety that is self-fruitful. So it'll, with just one tree, you can still get olives. So that's maybe a really important starting point. And then, of course, the next question is, well, what variety should I get? And there's lots, but I'll tell you my favorite one is one that's called Frantoio, and it's self-fertile, and it's fairly common if you go to some of the specialty nurseries.
Excellent. And so the care that it needs in order to, will it just automatically, or I'm assuming it needs full sun?
Yeah, good question. So yes, so olives will do best in full sun. And of course, in home gardens, we don't always have full sun everywhere. So people always say, well, what about partial sun? And you just have to adjust your expectations accordingly.
Hmm.
So let's put it this way, the more sun, the better. And then of course, people wonder, well, how big do I have to let this grow? And think about bonsai, where you have these trees that are 100 years old and maybe they're knee high.
Yeah.
So it all comes back to the gardener. As the gardener, you're the boss, and you can decide through a choice of pruning and root pruning and pot size how big that olive tree will get. So you don't have to end up with some mammoth tree that you have trouble moving around. If you want something smaller, then that's quite realistic. Now, for myself, I keep them to about 6 feet high. I'm using 14-inch pots, 6 foot high trees, and that's just great for me when I'm moving them somewhere for winter protection. But it is also big enough that they have this really nice ornamental effect in the garden.
Yeah, that would make a statement. And I know we were talked about, you can get self-pollinating so that you'd have olives, but I think it's um more purposeful to just the beauty of them, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, they are stunningly beautiful.
Yeah. So let's talk about, so that's interesting, 14-inch pot, 6 foot tree, which is, I think, what you need for most homes, right? Scale wise.
Mhm.
And throughout the season, aside from sunlight and obviously water, do they need any other type of love while in during the growing season?
Well, you will want to prune it eventually
Okay.
because you want to, well, you want it to fit into your garden. You want it to
Hmm.
look nice, and you want to pick a form that suits you. So there's not a right or wrong in terms of shape. Sometimes people prefer a bush. Some people might want a multi-stem tree or a single stem. So you have a lot of choice that way, but
Okay.
eventually you want to prune them. And that's something that I usually do either in the late fall as I'm storing them for winter, or early spring before they start to grow. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. And without going into a ton of detail, I'd say the main thing that you want to remember with pruning is that olives will fruit on the wood from the previous season. So what that means is if you have your heart set on a topiary, and I've seen this where people grow a little olive tree, which is like a pom-pom on top of a stick, and you're shearing it like a sheep every year, you're probably cutting off all of the fruiting wood and you won't get any fruit. And that's okay if that's
Yeah.
the look that you want and you're not counting on olives. But if you go into this and you're thinking, I'd like a few olives to share around too, then just remember that pruning is something that you want to think about.
Okay, that's going to be much more selective with your pruning if you want
Mhm.
fruit. Now, when it comes to, so other than that, so it doesn't need any fertilizer necessarily. Is it
Uh,
potting soil it's in, or a certain kind of potting soil that you should
yeah,
buy?
so like any potted plant, you'll want to feed it.
Hmm.
And, when it comes to feeding my potted plants, I don't get into a lot of exotic fertilizers because you do find if you go shopping, there's probably an exotic fertilizer for everything. And you get into
Yeah.
the agronomic bulletins for olives, you could come away utterly confused. So I think for a home gardener, use an all-purpose fertilizer. That's what I use for my olives. And in the spring, I put on some slow release fertilizer that releases through the summer. I do it
Okay.
at a partial rate. And then I supplement that through the summer with a liquid feed at a low rate. I spoon feed it with a little bit of liquid feed as well. So that's my approach. You could ask a bunch of growers, you might get different responses. But the key
Exactly.
thing is, right, if we're home gardeners, we want it to be simple. And this is a good way to keep it simple.
Yes, exactly. Oh, that's good.
And
And
you were asking about soil, Joanne.
Mhm.
And so the the big thing is you don't want the roots to be sopping wet all the time, right? So you want enough moisture, but you want a soil that drains well.
Okay.
And the other thing is, I was talking about these 6 foot trees of mine, and they're in pots that are only 14 inches wide. So sometimes if we get windy days and you don't have a heavy
Mm,
enough soil, they can
mhm,
topple over. So what I like to do is instead of using just an off-the-shelf potting mix that's usually soilless, it's very light, I'll take something like that, but then I'll amend it with some garden loam and with some sand, and I'm making something that still drains well, but it's heavy as well. Heavy
mhm.
as in it weighs down that pot, so I don't have to worry every time there's a wind.
Now, if you buy one at the nursery, do you need to repot it right away from what it's already in, or is that only as it ages?
You might or might not. It really depends how
Mhm.
well rooted it is into the pot. So it's a good question. And when you bring home that olive plant from the nursery, just tip it out of the pot and have a look at what those roots are like. If they're tightly coiled and they're circling around the pot, then it's time to move it up to a bigger pot. But you won't know until you tip it out and have a
Okay.
look.
Okay.
And one other comment though is if you're coming home with a small plant, and it's not a big tree that you're worried about tipping over, don't overcomplicate things with a fancy soil mix. Just use an off-the-shelf potting soil until it gets to be a bigger plant that you want more weight in that potting soil.
Right, right. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Excellent. And so you've been overwintering them, so you can bring them out when, like, what time of year? Like, how early can you bring them out of storage? And then we'll talk about the winter storage. Like, what's the season for our lovely olive trees?
Okay, so maybe I should back up a little bit and
Sure.
say that, okay, so the olive tree, when it's growing in the ground, it can freeze. And
Oh,
so it can go down below freezing, but it can't take the temperatures that I get here in Toronto. But if you go to the west coast of Canada, on some of those Gulf islands, there are actually people growing olive trees in the ground. So that's just to start this discussion about winter
hmm.
temperatures. Now, the thing is, as soon as you grow something in a pot, it can't get as cold as that plant might in the ground because what happens is that the soil within that pot and then the olives within that freeze and thaw and freeze and thaw
Hmm.
more than they would in the ground. And that's a stress for the plant. So just as a general rule with a potted plant, you don't have that same cold tolerance. So now with our potted olives, I recommend you might be able to leave them somewhere and they have a light freeze, but why risk it if you're going to
Yeah.
all this trouble to grow an olive tree? So I'm lucky I have somewhere that stays cool over the winter. It's a little greenhouse that's minimally heated. I keep it at about 2 degrees Celsius, and my olive trees spend the winter there.
With your
And
fig trees, with the fig
with my
trees?
fig trees, with my
Yeah.
citrus trees, but one thing to think about if you're hoping to get olives is that your olive tree will flower and fruit after it gets chill hours, cold temperatures. It
Okay.
needs cold temperatures in order to flower. And this isn't actually unusual if you think about it, because we don't see apples from Florida, for example, because apple trees need some cool weather to induce the
Hmm.
flowering. So it's the same with our olives. They need some
Okay.
cool. So you could actually keep your olive in the house like a house plant all winter. But because it's warm, because it's not getting those chill hours, then you probably won't get flowers and fruit. So it's actually
Okay.
best if you store your olive somewhere cold. So I told you about my cold greenhouse.
Hmm.
I've also kept it in a cold, dark garage. And people sometimes say, well, wait a minute, dark? Because don't olive trees keep their leaves through the winter? And they do, but if it's cold enough, the tree just stops growing. So a little bit of dark through the winter. is okay. Maybe you have a breezeway, maybe you have a sun porch. There's a lot of different things you could do to give your olive some cold through the winter to satisfy those chill hours.
Okay, because I have a garage that stays cold, but it has a window on like on the side. So it's not like direct light, but it would be light in the, would that be okay?
Yeah, that would be perfect.
Excellent. Because so far the figs have been successful and surviving them. I'm still want to talk to you a little bit at the end of the show about getting some figs.
Okay.
But okay, so that but you could bring it in as a potted plant and then take it back out like some of the other tropicals. You know, some
Oh, for
people are
sure.
bringing, you know, their
Yeah.
palm trees and the banana trees in and out a bit.
Yeah, because the olive leaves, if you haven't seen them, they're small, they're thick, they're
Mhm.
leathery. So these are really resilient plants. When I was a kid, I used to go to a barber shop where they had a potted olive tree in the window, and it was there 365 days a year. So they never saw olives on it, but
Yeah.
it looked nice.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
yeah, the leaves are actually gorgeous. I think of all the artificial plants, like, you see in decor and in magazines when it's an artificial olive tree, they're beautiful. And so I think I think the way they've made them artificial is because of how beautiful the real ones are, just in
Hmm.
the sense you don't see really artificial, well done artificial other tropicals, but yeah, olive trees are beautiful, and I've seen them in grown in nature, like in Europe, and they're just, it's just amazing to see just
Yeah,
olive trees, in
yeah.
person. So the thought of being able to grow that, I'm just so excited, and that you can get olives. So, is there any other prep as far as the winter storage to move them, into the garage or into a cold storage?
No, there's no
No.
fancy prep. As I said, I'll often prune mine in the late fall before I store them because that way the tree's a little bit smaller and I can
Hmm.
fit in more trees into my small storage space.
Right, right. So,
And I think it's important to mention, though, when you come to springtime, so even though I said here's a tree that can take temperatures just a bit below freezing, so people might be thinking in the spring, okay, let's just move them on out as soon as there's no snow. But if you've got any tender new growth on there in the spring, then if that's hit by frost or cold wind, it could get damaged. So don't rush in the spring. There's always a tendency we're eager to get things outdoors, but
mhm.
in the spring, think of it as being a little bit more tender if it's started to grow.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to ask that. I actually haven't even brought my figs out. They're growing in the garage, but it's still been cool at night.
Yeah.
So here in Ontario, so I know our listeners could be from anywhere. So it really depends on your weather where you are locally, and right, and when your spring and your fall and your winter kind of begins. So that's something to keep in mind, which is another reason to buy Stephen's book because it has all that information right handy for you. And I have the Fig book, which is a very handy tool for me to refer to. So definitely a shout out for anyone who's interested on whether you want olives or not is to pick up Stephen's book and all that. They can order your book on Amazon, and I'll have all
Hmm.
that information in the show notes as well for this show.
Yeah.
Um, so tell me what else. Like, so when you bring it out in the spring, oh no, when they're in storage. So this is something. Are you watering it at all through the winter, or are we just letting it go kind of dormant?
That's a good question. Yeah, so these plants, they keep their leaves, they're evergreen, which means they
Mhm.
keep their leaves through the winter. And so because of that, they will lose a little bit more moisture through those leaves through the winter. And that soil through the winter might need a little bit of water. Now, the thing is, how much or how often you need to water it will really depend on where you're keeping it. Think of a centrally heated home. The air in there is quite dry.
Mhm.
Or compare that to, say, a damp greenhouse with an earthen floor. So I can't give you, every so many days you need to water. And the best thing is always to just stick your finger in the soil. And when it's feeling dry, then you'll water. So
Okay.
you don't want it to become bone dry. And actually, that brings up a good point. Sometimes people picture olives growing in these Mediterranean countries in parched soil. And so they think, oh, yeah, I don't really need to water that. But a potted olive tree is very different from an olive growing in the soil, which will have
Mhm.
roots that go everywhere. So you can't uh, give it that arid climate treatment when it's growing in a pot.
Okay. I want to jump back to the fact that you can grow it in the ground as well in Ontario.
Mhm. In Ontario, I wouldn't recommend it
Oh, okay.
because we just don't have warm enough winters. Now, I mentioned some of the Gulf Islands in
Hmm.
BC. They're growing them in the ground. And then there's also a really amazing grower on Vancouver Island, just outside of Victoria. And it's not quite as warm there. So what he does is he grows them flat against the side of his house. And in the wintertime, he puts up a curtain of horticultural fleece and he puts some Christmas lights on his olives, incandescent ones that give off a little bit of heat. So on really cold nights, he could plug in the lights and those olives are protected. So, a really fun thing. Fruit, trees, and more. Bob Duncan is the horticulturist. He's got some videos on YouTube. If you're interested in this, check out Bob. He's been one of my olive mentors.
Oh, wonderful. How many olive trees do you have, Stephen?
I have three big ones. And
Hmm.
of course, I've always got endless cuttings on the go because I'm an incorrigible propagator and I can't prune something and not try to propagate that wood. But maybe I should mention too. So yes, people wanting to propagate your own olives, you can propagate them from cuttings. You can also do what's called air layering, which is where you wrap a branch with some damp potting soil and maybe put a plastic bag around that to keep that soil damp. And with air layering, sometimes people will wound it or apply a little bit of rooting hormone to speed up the process. But you can air layer, you can do cuttings. But what's even better is that as your olive tree gets bigger, olives are notorious for sending up suckers or little shoots from the base. And
Oh,
if you're lucky, these little shoots might even have some roots on them. And so you can just get in there with your shears or with a knife and cut them off, and you have a ready to go plant.
oh, isn't that easy?
Hmm.
Excellent. So they really seem like an easy plant to have.
Hmm. They are a very easy plant to have. And if people say, well, my olive died, there's usually two things that are the most common. In the summertime, they let it dry out too much because there's
Mm.
this idea of, oh, I have to let it get parched. Not the case. And in the wintertime, it's easy to overwater and keep that soil sodden. And then you
Oh,
could get
okay.
some root rot. So those are
Mm.
the two things that are the most common reasons for an olive tree dying. But they're
Okay.
tough as nails.
Yes. And you were mentioning, so you're keeping yours in a 14-inch pot. So does that mean you're root pruning it? Like you're taking it out and having to root prune it to kind of keep it in that pot?
Exactly. So, and I don't do this every year. I prune the branches every year, and then every third or fourth year, I'll lift it out of the pot. I'll cut away some of the roots. I'll put in some fresh soil and then pot it back into that same pot because I don't want anything bigger. That's big enough for me.
Right, right. But if somebody has more room and more storage, they can let it get bigger and go to like a 10-gallon pot.
Oh
But then
yeah.
you can't move it really, right? That becomes maybe you get one of those dollies with on wheels.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's something to think about. And I'm assuming you cover all of that in the book, right? On how to do the root pruning.
Yeah, A to Z.
A to Z,
A to
which is
Z.
excellent, which is great. Yeah, your guides and how you do everything is so well done. So I think that's great. And when you say we can get olives, like, are you saying we can get like a handful of olives, or like what is a typical crop of olives?
It's a good question. So it'll depend, it depends on the size of the tree, depends on the variety,
Mm.
depends on the year. So if you have, say for a 6 foot tree, maybe you'll get a small mixing bowl full of olives. So not to set the expectation you'll have bushels of olives here.
Right.
You gotta keep in mind the size of the tree. Um, and actually, though, that brings up one thing I didn't mention so far that's just a fun little bit of trivia is that olives have this habit, which many other fruiting plants have, like apples, called alternate bearing. And what that means is if you leave them to their own devices, they'll make a really heavy crop one year and then nothing the next year.
Okay.
And so that is in it, we prune to help minimize this alternate bearing. So in pruning, you're not only keeping the tree in the shape that you want, but you're also helping that tree to give you fruit every year because you've pruned off a bit of the fruiting wood. So the fruit load isn't as heavy, and then it'll fruit consistently year after year.
Okay. Or if you do want that, like you want a bigger amount every other
Hmm.
year, because you could have
Yeah.
trees on the alternate side. Like if you have two trees, right? They could be on alternate cycles,
Hmm.
maybe, right? Depending. If we were to bring it into the house and, into the dining room or living room, it needs light, I'm assuming as well.
Hmm. Yeah,
Okay.
light is what you want. So you'll
Okay.
want somewhere with a nice bright south window.
Okay. So it should be a bright, not like a diffused north window or east window. It's still looking for
No,
that bright light.
bright light's best because if you have that really diffuse light, the tree would probably survive. But what will happen is it's indoors, so it might keep growing, and then you'll get this very weak, lanky growth. So the
Mm,
brighter, the better.
okay. That's great information.
Mhm.
Excellent. Well, I think we've covered everything. Is there anything else you think we should talk about?
I think you've asked all the right questions.
Thank you.
And just to go back to whether you like olives, eating olives or not, it is just such a beautiful plant for the light, for the shimmering, for the texture that it adds to the garden. So it's beautiful. That's all I think
Excellent.
that's a good ending.
Okay, perfect. Well, that sounds like a great way to end the show. And I think it's a great topic and a great book. And also look for Stephen's book on how to grow lemons where you think you can't, as well as how to grow figs. That is our show for today. If you have any questions, all the Stephen's contact information will be on the show notes. And yeah, I'm excited to go looking for a fig tree, or not, sorry, fig tree, an olive tree. I really am because they are beautiful. And I never even thought I could have one in the house here. So the thought that I could have one outside is very exciting.
Hmm.
So thank you for joining me here today, Stephen.
Thanks, Joanne. Pleasure.
Thanks everyone for joining me down the garden path. Check me out on your favorite podcast app as well as YouTube, where you can see Stephen and I have our conversation. Thanks everyone.